Amid the fertile valleys of Israel, under the oppressive weight of Philistine domination, the Hebrew people cried out for deliverance. Hope seemed distant until a divine promise was fulfilled. From a barren woman, a boy was born, chosen from the womb, consecrated as a Nazirite, set apart for God. His name, Samson. From the earliest days, something extraordinary surrounded him. His strength did not come from training nor from weapons. It was something sacred, a raw, uncontrollable power that struck fear into even the most hardened hearts. By snapping chains like dry twigs and killing a lion with his bare hands, Samson grew into a symbol of mystery and power, loved by some, feared by others. But with the gift came the burden. Samson was no ordinary warrior. His fight was not just against armies, but against himself. Impulsive, passionate, and at times reckless, he was a man in constant conflict between divine purpose and human desires. In this epic journey, we will witness the rise of Israel's greatest warrior, his colossal battles, his ardent loves, his painful betrayals, and the price paid for such a great gift. Get ready to dive into the story of a hero unlike any other. A man chosen by God, whose strength was legendary, but whose heart was vulnerable. This is the saga of Samson, the warrior of superhuman strength. From an early age, Samson was different. The villagers of Zorah watched him with suspicious, curious, and sometimes awed eyes. While other children ran and played with rocks, Samson lifted stones. When the boys built huts out of dry branches, he uprooted small trees with his bare hands. His ever-vigilant mother reminded him, "You are consecrated to God. Never cut your hair, never touch wine, never break your vow to the Lord." His father, Manoah, was a just man. He raised Samson with rigor, but also with fear. After all, it wasn't every day that an angel appeared to announce the birth of a liberator. From the beginning, they knew this boy was an instrument of divine justice, and with that came responsibility, one that Samson didn't always seem ready to shoulder. As the years passed, the fame of his strength spread, but there was one thing about Samson that no one could control: his impulsiveness. One day, as he was walking in the fields, a hungry lion emerged from the bushes. A roar echoed across the hills. Any ordinary man would have fled, but Samson stayed, his eyes filled with fury. With a fierce cry, he threw himself at the beast and with his bare hands tore the lion in two. That night, he told no one. He kept it a secret, as if the brutal act had been just another silent confirmation that he was more than human. Later, when he returned the same way, he saw the lion's corpse and something strange inside it. A swarm of bees had made the dead body their hive. Samson picked up a handful of honey and tasted it, a symbolic breaking of his Nazirite vow, even if he didn't realize it. The line between right and wrong, between the holy and the profane, was beginning to blur. Time passed, and Samson, now a grown man, went to Timnah, a Philistine city. There he met a woman who captured his heart, not a Hebrew, but a foreigner. Her gaze was penetrating, her presence mysterious. He returned home, determined. "I want this woman for my wife." His parents protested. "Why don't you choose a wife from our people?" they asked. But Samson was firm, or stubborn, and desire spoke louder. What he didn't even know was that this marriage was part of a bigger plan. God would use even Samson's impulses to start a confrontation with the Philistines. It was the beginning of something bigger, of a silent and bloody war. During the wedding celebration, Samson posed a riddle to the 30 Philistine companions who accompanied him. Inspired by the scene of the honey and the lion, he said, "From the eater came what is eaten, from the strong came sweetness." The men accepted the challenge. If they could find the answer in 7 days, they would win 30 tunics. If not, they would give them to him. But the Philistines, fearing humiliation, pressured Samson's bride. She wept, begged, and manipulated him until he revealed the secret. On the 7th day, they responded, "What is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion?" Samson realized the betrayal. His eyes burned with anger. He did not back down. He kept his promise, but in his own way. He killed 30 men from another Philistine city, took their clothes, and gave them as a prize. And then he left his wife in a rage. The tension between Samson and the Philistines was beginning to boil. This was not just a personal dispute. It was the beginning of a silent war, a war between oppression and freedom, between God's calling and the desires of a real man. Humiliation was something Samson could not bear. The betrayal in the riddle was only the beginning. When he returned to collect his wife, he discovered that she had been given to another, to one of his own feast companions. His blood boiled. The world went dark before his eyes. And what followed was not just an emotional reaction, it was a fiery revenge. With steady hands and a burning heart, Samson captured 300 foxes. He tied them in pairs, tail to tail, and placed flaming torches between them. He released them into the Philistines' grain fields, which burned as if the sky itself had spewed fire onto the earth. The entire crop was destroyed: barley, vineyards, and olive groves. The livelihood of a people was burned by one man. The enraged Philistines sought the cause of that brutal attack. When they learned that it was because of Timnah's wife, they acted savagely. They burned the house and killed her and her father. They thought that this would tame the beast, but they fed the monster. Samson swore revenge, no longer for love, but for justice. With immense strength, he faced armed men with his bare hands. Bones broke, screams echoed through the valleys. The ground turned red. When the fighting ceased, bodies littered the ground. These were no ordinary warriors who had fallen. They were soldiers of the Philistine Empire. Samson took refuge in the cave of the rock of Etam. He knew he was now a target, one man alone against an empire. And the empire would not rest until it saw him on his knees. The Philistines marched on Judah, demanding that they hand him over. In fear, 3,000 men from Judah came to Samson, not to fight on his side, but to hand him over. "You know the Philistines rule over us. What are you doing?" they said. Without resistance, Samson allowed them to tie him up on the condition that they would not kill him themselves. Tied up with new ropes, he was led to the enemy army. But the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in fury. The ropes snapped like burning threads. Samson saw a donkey's jawbone on the ground. He grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men with it, 1,000 warriors, alone. The field was silent until the screams stopped. The dust settled, and in the center of the destruction stood a man, sweaty, exhausted, on his knees, crying out to God, "You have accomplished this great salvation through your servant. Shall I now die of thirst?" God, in his mercy, opened a cleft in the rock, and water gushed out. Samson drank, and he came back to life. And so, on that day, he was officially recognized as the judge of Israel. But glory came at a price. Samson was increasingly lonely, his strength feared, his fury unpredictable. And your soul? Divided. On the outside, he was an indestructible warrior. On the inside, he was a man in conflict, with God, with men, with himself. For the next few years, Samson continued to attack Philistine positions without mercy. It was no longer just revenge. It was a cycle of personal and spiritual warfare. He was a liberator, but he was not a leader. He did not lead armies. He was a one-man army. And deep down, even with all the power he had, he felt empty. He lacked peace. He lacked direction. He lacked love. And when it came in disguise. Her name was Delilah. In the valley of Sorek, where the vines danced in the wind and the scent of sweet flowers filled the air, there lived a woman whose beauty was almost hypnotic. Her name was Delilah. Unlike all the other women Samson had known, she was cunning, seductive, and mysterious. Her eyes seemed to hide ancient secrets. And her smile, oh, Delilah's smile could soothe even the fiercest warrior. When Samson first saw her, it was as if the world around him had gone silent. The warrior who had killed 1,000 men with one jawbone was disarmed with a glance. He gave himself to her with the same intensity with which he threw himself into battle. without reservations, without strategy, without shields. Delilah, in turn, welcomed him with tender arms and sweet words. But deep down, she was not guided by love. She was driven by another force, the gold of the Philistines. The rulers of the 5 major Philistine kingdoms sought her out, not with threats, but with an offer you can't refuse. Discover the secret of Samson's strength, and each of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. It was an incalculable fortune. A single job, one single question, a single mistake by Samson. Delilah accepted, and so the game began. In the intimacy of her bed, with a soft voice and gentle touch, she asked, "Samson, my love, tell me, where does your great strength come from? How could you be bound and defeated?" Samson smiled. He joked about the question. He said that if he were tied with 7 new ropes, he would lose his strength. Delilah waited for him to fall asleep. Tied with the ropes, he called to the Philistines, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He stood up. The rope snapped and fell like straw. Delilah pretended. She cried. She said he was making fun of her, and she tried again. The second time he lied again. New strings and never used. She repeated the ambush. Same result, ruin for the Philistines. On the third attempt, he mentioned hair, though not entirely. He spoke of braids tied to a loom. Once more she tried, and once more Samson escaped, but each lie he told was another step closer to the abyss. Delilah wouldn't give up, and Samson was beginning to weaken. She confronted him with tears and blackmail. "How can you say you love me if your heart is not with me?" She was not only beautiful, she was persistent, tireless, and he, tired of resisting, his soul weakened by passion, finally gave in, revealed everything. "No razor has ever come over my head, because I have been a Nazirite from birth. If they cut my hair, my strength will go away. I will be like any other man." That night, Delilah knew it was true. And for the first time, her eyes did not shine with passion, but with power. She made Samson sleep on her lap. She called a servant. 7 braids of hair were cut off. The vow was broken. The covenant with God broken. "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He stood up, confident as before. But something was wrong. The weight in his arms, the agility, the heat that used to pulse, they were gone. The Lord was no longer with him. And the Philistines overpowered him and thrust iron into his eyes and took him in chains to Gaza, the strongest man in Israel, now blind, humiliated, and a slave. The iron chains cut into his wrists. Every step he took was a reminder of all he had lost. Samson, the invincible warrior, was now just a man, blind, exhausted, and humiliated. Gaza, the enemy city, celebrated his imprisonment as a divine victory. To the Philistines, the gods had triumphed over the God of Israel. Dragged through the streets like a war trophy, Samson was spat on, ridiculed, and treated like an animal. The crowd jeered, children threw stones, women laughed at the giant's fall. The men cried out, "This is the man who burned our fields, who killed 1,000 with one jawbone. Where is his strength now?" But the worst prison was not the cell. It was the silence of God, the absence, the emptiness. In the darkness of his blindness, Samson thought, he remembered every step that led him there. The call still echoed in his mind. "You will be a Nazirite from the womb." He remembered his mother's voice, from his father's eyes, of the lion, from honey, of victories, and Delilah. Ah, Delilah. He wondered how he had fallen so low, how he had traded a divine calling for fleeting passions, how he had traded strength for vanity, faith for pride. Time passed slowly, and in the midst of the darkness, something silent began to happen. His hair began to grow again. It wasn't just a physical detail. It was symbolic, regeneration, a new beginning, a sign that although he had fallen, he was still alive. And while the world saw him as defeated, within him, God was preparing something greater. In prison, he was forced to grind the millstones like a beast of burden. Hard, repetitive, humiliating work, day after day, in silence, in the dark, alone. But it was there that Samson learned what he had never learned in victories: to depend, listening, silencing one's own pride, to recognize that true strength did not come from his hair nor his arms, but from the God who had always been with him until the day he chose to walk alone, and God still heard him. Meanwhile, on the Philistine side, arrogance grew. For them, winning was not enough. They wanted to show off their victory to the world. They decided to organize a great celebration in the temple of Dagon, their god. They gathered thousands of people, rulers, soldiers, nobles. Everyone wanted to see the human trophy of their glory. "Bring us Samson, let him amuse us," they cried. And Samson was taken to the temple, blind, weak, but calm. There was something new in his face. It was no longer the look of an impulsive warrior. It was the silence of someone who had learned from pain, of someone who understood that there was still a purpose, even in ruin. Led by a young servant, Samson reached the center of the temple. The roar of the crowd was deafening, but inside, the prayer was silent. "Lord God, remember me, give me strength just this once more." The crowd didn't see it, but something was changing. Samson wasn't asking for revenge for himself. He wasn't asking for glory. He was asking for redemption. He was asking for the chance to fulfill, even in the end, what he had been called to do. And there, between the columns that supported the temple, blind and humiliated, a new Samson stood up. Not the brute force one, but that of spiritual strength, the broken man who finally surrendered and to fulfill his purpose. With Samson chained and blinded, the people of Israel were plunged once again into a dark time. The warrior who had challenged empires with his bare hands had disappeared, and with him the only visible resistance against Philistine rule. In every Hebrew village, Samson's name was whispered with fear, shame, and longing. He was strong, but he was foolish. He was our judge, and he abandoned us because of a woman. Maybe God left us with him. The Israelites' faith was beginning to waver. Accustomed to seeing Samson as an extension of God's arm, many did not understand what had happened. For them, the judge's downfall was the downfall of the divine plan itself. But they were wrong. The plan was not finished. It was simply being rebuilt, brick by brick, in the silence of pain. Meanwhile, the Philistines celebrated. For the first time in decades, their 5 lords, Ashdod, Gaza, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron, were in perfect harmony. The common enemy had been defeated. The symbol of Hebrew resistance had been humbled. The victory seemed final. They were now preparing for the greatest event of all, the celebration at the Temple of Dagon, the god of fertility and war. The halls were decorated, altars were erected, and invitations were sent to all the cities of Philistia. More than 3,000 guests would be invited, including rulers, priests, nobles, and even elite soldiers. Everyone wanted to see for themselves the tamed beast that had once terrorized the borders. And in the midst of all this, Delilah had disappeared. No one knew her whereabouts. Some said she had been rewarded with a mansion and gold. Others said she had been killed in secret, so she would never betray her allies. To Samson, it mattered little. Her name no longer brought pain, it brought understanding. She had been an instrument, just as he had been, just as they all would be. In the darkness of his prison, Samson's hair grew, but more than that, his clarity grew. For the first time in his life, he understood the nature of his strength. It was not a curse nor a gift to be used for himself. It was a purpose, a calling, and for the first time he prayed not for victory, nor for revenge, but for redemption. If I can fulfill what I left behind, even if it costs me my life, so be it. As the temple prepared for its final celebration, rumors spread among the humblest of Israel. Some said that Samson's hair was coming back. Others swore that God would yet speak through him. There was fear, but also hope. In one of these villages, a boy asked his father, "Father, can God still use Samson, even after what he did?" The man, looking at the sky, replied, "If God only used the perfect, none of us would be any good." Samson fell, but God still hears him. Meanwhile, with each hammer struck on the temple of Dagon, Philistine arrogance grew. "We will show the world who the true God is," they said, and what was supposed to be just an exhibition now took on religious, spiritual, and political overtones. It would be the final humiliation of the people of Israel, but little did they know that they were setting the stage not for a spectacle, but for a sentence. In the basement of the temple, chained, guided by a boy blind to the truth but full of curiosity, Samson took a deep breath. He knew the moment was approaching, and with each step, each silent prayer, he rebuilt himself inside. The temple that the Philistines built in honor of their God would, unbeknownst to him, be the site of Samson's last and most powerful act. Dagon's temple was grand. Its massive stone columns supported a roof that seemed to touch the sky. It was packed with spectators, 3,000 on the roof, thousands in the galleries. The Philistine leaders were all there, laughing, toasting, praising their God for the victory over their greatest enemy in history. The air was thick with arrogance. And then the doors opened. The crowd fell silent for a moment. In the center of the entrance, chained and led by a boy, appeared Samson. He walked slowly. Each step was an effort, not physical, but emotional. He couldn't see, but he felt. He felt the stairs, the muffled laughter, the vibration of the ground marked by the footsteps of those who came to see his misfortune. "Is that the great Samson?" someone shouted. "It looks more like a blind dog." The crowd laughed. The Philistine rulers toasted. Priests danced in front of the statue of Dagon. It was a spectacle of mockery. But Samson was at peace. The boy guiding him was young, maybe 8 or 9. He didn't fully understand who this man was. But when he took his arm, he felt something different. There was weight, yes, but also firmness. It was like holding the hand of an ancient tree, firm, even at the end. "Can you take me to the pillars that support the temple?" Samson asked in a low voice. The boy hesitated. "You're not going to try to run away, are you?" Samson smiled, even without seeing. "No, little one. I just need to feel something solid." Guided to the center of the hall, Samson reached out his hands. He touched the columns with his fingers. He felt the coldness of the stone, the beating of the temple. He knew this was it, the heart of the structure. The boy was still close. Samson bent down a little, feeling his presence. "What is your name?" "Ephraim." "Are you Hebrew?" "On! Run, Ephraim, go back to your house. Now, run without looking back." The boy hesitated. He wanted to understand, but something in his voice did not allow questions. He obeyed. He ran through the crowd, leaving without being noticed. He would be the only survivor. Samson was left alone. With his hands firmly on the pillars, he raised his invisible face to the sky. The noise around him was deafening, but inside him there was silence, a silence full of meaning. And there, in that last conversation with God, Samson did not ask for glory. He did not ask for revenge. He just said, "Lord my God, strengthen me just this once, so that I may accomplish what I was born to accomplish. May I die with your enemies. May your will be done even with my life." Up above, the rulers were toasting. One of them shouted, "Dagon reigns. The God of Israel is dead with his blind servant." Little did they know that they were about to see that the God of Israel did not need eyes to see, nor perfect warriors to act. The strength returned, but not like before. It wasn't an explosion of fury. It was a calm, sure energy that ran through Samson's body like a divine whisper. He took a deep breath. He tightened his spine. There was silence, and waited for the moment. The sound of the celebration filled the temple like a raging sea. Cups clashed, laughter erupted, musicians played flutes and drums, while the priests of Dagon danced in ecstasy, believing they were living the height of their victory. The crowd looked at Samson as if he were part of the decoration, a broken ornament from the past, the blind, the defeated, the forgotten. But no one saw what was happening inside. Samson's hands were now fixed on the pillars, the fingers firm, like roots clinging to the earth. He couldn't move his arms yet, he could just feel. He felt the pulse of the temple, the weight of each stone upon him, the echo of footsteps, the vibration of the structure. It was as if he was hearing the temple breathing, and God was about to speak through him. All around, the weather was beginning to change, subtly. Some birds flying over the temple seemed restless. The torches, previously stable, began to tremble with small currents of air. The wind suddenly passed through cracks that had not been noticed before. Up above, among the nobles seated on the terrace, a lady raised her head. "The ground is shaking," he whispered. "It's the musicians, my lady, the vibration of the drums." But it wasn't the drums. Samson kept his feet firmly on the stone floor. The legs, which had been shaky before, were now as steady as columns. His shoulders straightened. The whole body stiffened. It wasn't just strength, it was focus, it was purpose. It was the Spirit of God returning, not to avenge, but to complete. In the main hall, one of the priests of Dagon approached the statue of the deity. He raised his hands and declared, "Look, O Philistines, he who destroyed our fields, who killed our warriors, is now the servant of our God. Dagon has won. Dagon reigns." The crowd roared. Shouts of celebration echoed like thunder. It was the height of arrogance. The moment when God's enemies thought they were invincible. It was at that exact moment that the world seemed to hold its breath. Samson silently moved his feet one last time. He felt the ground. He fixed his position. His hands gripped the pillars. He murmured, "Now," and he pushed. At first, nothing seemed to happen, just a sound. Low, like stones rearranging themselves. A scream was heard in the background. Someone pointed. One of the side columns shook. A piece of plaster fell from the ceiling. And then the snap came, a dry, sharp sound, as if the temple had woken up to its own end. "What's going on?" shouted one of the men from Gaza. "He's pushing," another replied in panic. Samson screamed, not in pain but in surrender. It was as if, in that push, he was offering his very being. Strength, pain, faith, memory, failure, hope, all condensed into one final act. The columns tilted, first slowly, then violently. The ceiling began to collapse. From above, nobles fell like leaves. The idol of Dagon fell, breaking into pieces. Side pillars began to crumble like dominoes. Screams of panic replaced laughter. People ran, stumbled, were crushed. It was as if creation itself was responding to the cry for justice. And in the center, still pushing, was Samson. The temple of Dagon, once a symbol of pride, was now a field of ruins. Columns toppled, stones scattered, and a deafening silence hung over what remained of Philistine arrogance. Dust covered everything, faces, bodies, broken statues. A world that had been celebrating minutes before was now marked by destruction. In the center of that collapse, under the rubble, was Samson. His body would not be found easily, but his last act echoed louder than 1,000 words. He died with the enemies he swore to fight. He died not as the impulsive man who loved his own desires, but as the judge who finally understood the purpose of his strength. The Philistine people were in shock. 5 kings had died, priests, soldiers, nobles, all crushed beneath the falling temple. The leadership of Philistia had been decapitated in a single moment, and the cause of it was a single man. Blind, forgetful, seemingly defeated, the news spread like wildfire. Knights who had escaped the fall, bloodied and covered in dust, crossed the roads, shouting about what they had seen. Many could not explain it. Others said it was an earthquake. Others, that the God of Israel himself had overthrown Dagon. And among the rubble, no image of the idol remained intact. In Israel, villages celebrated with tears. The elders fell to their knees as they heard the story. Samson had destroyed the temple of Dagon. killing thousands of Philistines. Oppression was beginning to crumble. The people who had once murmured against the judge now wept for his courage. Ephraim, the little servant who had led Samson to the pillars, ran for hours until he found his father. His face was dirty. His hands were shaking. He tried to explain what he saw. "Dad, he didn't ask for help. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He knew what was going to happen." The father hugged him. For the first time, he saw in his son's eyes not fear, but reverence. "You were a witness to God's plan, my son. He saved me." In Zorah, Samson's home village, Manoah and his wife received their son's remains a few days later. Men from the people of Judah traveled to Gaza to retrieve his body. They found him among the rubble, his face serene as if he was sleeping. They brought him back with honor, without war chants, but with deep respect. He was buried between Zorah and Eshtaol in his father's tomb. And over his grave, not a statue was erected, but a simple stone with the name Samson, Judge of Israel. He conquered more in his death than in his life. Samson's legacy was not just his strength, it was a reminder that even the weakest, when surrendered to God, can change the course of a nation. That even those who have made mistakes, who have fallen, who have been forgotten, can still be instruments in the hands of the Almighty. In the absence of the hero, the people began to rise again. Faith was renewed. Philistine oppression, though still present, was disorganized. Fear had changed sides, and in every village, every house, every altar, a new flame was kindled. God is still with us. The collapse of the Temple of Dagon was not just the collapse of a building, it was the collapse of an empire. For decades, the Philistines ruled Israel with an iron fist, using fear as their weapon. They controlled crops, imposed taxes, and took sons and daughters as servants. The Hebrew people, divided into tribes and without unified leadership, barely survived until Samson. And now, with a single final act, he had changed the balance of power. The death of the 5 Philistine princes created a vacuum. The city-states, once allies of convenience, began to divide. There was no longer any consensus, no central authority. Rumors of internal strife, rebellions among soldiers, and even cults collapsing began to spread like wildfire. Some priests tried to rebuild the idols, gluing together the broken parts of Dagon, but something had changed. The people doubted. The faith that had seemed unshakable now trembled. After all, if their God was so powerful, why hadn't he protected his own temple? Among the Philistines, arguments raged. Some blamed Samson, others Delilah, some Dagon himself. The most fearful began to whisper, "The God of Israel is real and awesome." Meanwhile, on the Hebrew side, something was beginning to emerge. Fear began to give way to courage. Villages that were previously hidden began to unite. The tribal elders began to gather again. The news of the fall of the temple was told and retold in circles, with tears and hope. The name Samson was no longer spoken with shame, but with respect. He was our judge. He died to fulfill what God called him to be. He fell like a man, but rose like a servant of the Most High. And the young people, those who had grown up hearing stories of defeat, now heard another story, that of a man who faced his mistakes and in the end defeated an army single-handedly. And this rekindled something forgotten: faith. The Philistines, still in shock, hesitated to attack again. Panic had penetrated their borders. They no longer saw the Hebrews as submissive slaves, but as a people whose God could move heaven and earth for his servants, even imperfect ones. Some Hebrew leaders began to write Samson's name in the annals of the judges. Others built altars in memory of his surrender. But the most important thing was not in the stones or in the ceremonies. It was in the hearts of the people. Ephraim's father, who had previously doubted, now taught his son, "Remember what you saw, my son. Not the fall, but the surrender. A strong man is not one who never falls. He is one who understands who he must rise for." In Zorah, Samson's tomb became a place of silence and prayer. No official ceremony, just people who came from far and wide to place stones on the grave as a sign of honor. Some prayed, others wept, and many just stood there in silence. The legacy was sealed. Samson, who began his journey as the impulsive and solitary judge, ended it as a symbol of redemption and purpose. He did not unite the tribes by the sword, but by sacrifice. And it was in this climate of reverence and transformation that the people of Israel prepared for a new era. Oppression did not disappear overnight, but now there was something stronger than fear. There was hope. The echo of Samson's fall reverberated more in the minds of the people than on the soil of the cities. In Israel, villagers once again lit lamps in their doorways as a symbol of faith. In Philistia, houses began to reinforce their gates, fearing a Hebrew uprising. But above all, it was within each man and woman that the real battle was fought. In Zorah, Samson's father Manoah stood before his son's grave. His calloused hands rested on the cold stone. His eyes were red. Beside him, his wife, the one who had received the angel's announcement so many years before, held a small basket of dates and honey. "He was never ours," she murmured. "Since the womb, he was already God's. But still, he was our son." Manoah finished with a choked voice. They no longer cried in pain, but in relief, because even with all his mistakes, Samson had returned to his purpose, and he had left in peace. On the other side of the hills, the boy Ephraim watched everything with different eyes. Ever since he had escaped from the temple, he had not been the same. In his heart, he carried a flame, a sense of calling, of mission. He knew he was going to die, the boy told his neighbors, but he smiled anyway, as if death were just the last act, and not the end. The elders listened in silence. Some began to write the story on scrolls of parchment. Others carved Samson's face in stone, but Ephraim only spoke, as someone who witnessed something that needed to be passed on. A new storyteller was born. Meanwhile, in Philistine cities like Gaza and Ashkelon, councils were meeting in despair. Some were calling for revenge, others were saying it might be time to retreat, to rethink alliances, to rethink gods. An entire city had fallen because of one man, and that was shaking the very fabric of the city. At the altars of Dagon, the priests tried to restore worship, but many of the faithful no longer returned. Their God had failed, and Samson's fear now turned to respect for the invisible God who sustained him. In the nights that followed, troubled dreams plagued important men. In visions, they saw pillars falling, shadows rising, and Samson's name echoing in the air. He was dead, but his presence still haunted them, and spiritually something was happening in Israel. Prayers began to rise again. Mothers taught their children to trust in God. Young people told the story in the squares. The faith that had been forgotten was now reborn with strength. The final confrontation was not with swords. It was between two invisible kingdoms, pride and faith, arrogance and surrender. Samson had left no heirs, he had no descendants, but he had left something more powerful, an example. The example that God does not use the perfect but the available, that the end, if it is in obedience, can be more glorious than 1,000 wrong beginnings. One silent morning, while the crickets sang among the olive trees, Manoah looked up at the sky and whispered, "He fell so many times, but he fell to his knees in the end, and that was enough." And the brightest star in the sky seemed to twinkle brighter that night. The dust had not yet completely settled over the ruins of Gaza, but throughout Israel and Philistia, the air had changed. It was as if the world were suspended between two breaths, the one before Samson and the one after. For many, the image of the temple falling had become legend even before the dust settled, but few knew what had really happened in those last seconds. What went on in the heart of the man who, even though blind, saw more than he had ever seen before? Inside the temple, at the exact moment the columns began to give way, the world seemed to stop. The screams of the crowd mingled with the sound of the cracking stones. But in the midst of the chaos, Samson was silent. His dead eyes saw more than the living eyes around him. He did not see the temple. He saw the sky. He saw the people. He saw the purpose. His thoughts were clearer than they had ever been. I have failed so many times. I have been driven by pride, by passion, by anger. But now I am where I am supposed to be, doing what I am supposed to do, giving it my all, for the promise, for the people, for God. Physical pain didn't matter. Muscles cracked, veins bulged, joints shook, but he didn't back down, because for the first time, he wasn't fighting for himself. He pushed with all his might, and he screamed, "Let me die with the enemies of the Lord." And in that cry, 1,000 voices of liberation echoed. It was as if all the accumulated oppression, all the pain of the people, all the shame of the past, had come out of his mouth in a final roar of justice. The ceiling collapsed, the columns gave way, the idol of Dagon fell face down on the ground, and the next moment it was all over. Silence, not the silence of death, but that of peace. What was heard afterwards were only the echoes, screams of terror, then wails, and finally, reverence. Samson died there, but it was not a defeat. It was surrender. Not far away, the boy Ephraim woke up with a start. His eyes were wide open, and his heart was racing. He ran to his father. "He's gone," he said, without anyone saying anything to him. The father just nodded, as if he had heard the same thing. At that moment, Manoah and his wife felt a chill cut through the dawn. They went out of the tent and looked up at the sky. A shooting star was crossing the sky. She held her husband's arm. He went all the way. And God was with him. The news traveled faster than the messengers. It was as if the air itself carried the truth. In Israel, the elders gathered the people together again, and for the first time in a long time, everyone heard the same voice. The testimony of a judge who fell to raise a nation. On the grave, they placed a simple inscription: "Here lies Samson, God's anointed, redeemed in the end." And that was the most powerful truth. He was not remembered for his strength, but for the delivery, by the faith he found in the dark, and by the sound of his last cry, which was not of rage nor of personal glory. It was the cry of a man who finally understood his calling. The fall of the temple marked the end of an era and the birth of a legend. Samson, the superhumanly strong judge whose name already echoed through the mountains of Judah and the valleys of Sorek, became more than a warrior. He became a symbol, not of invincibility, but of something far more powerful: redemption. His last act was not a display of anger. It was not out of pride. It was not out of the wounded ego of someone who had been betrayed. It was out of faith, out of surrender, out of purpose. In his death, he finally became the man God called him to be from the womb. And it was there, under the rubble of that pagan temple, that God won, not by the strength of 1,000 armies, but by the obedience of one broken man. The story spread like wildfire among the people. In Israel, parents would tell their children around campfires, "He was called from birth. He fell, yes, but he rose with more power than ever when he understood the reason for his existence." Samson's name came to be sung in simple psalms, murmured by shepherds and travelers. It was no longer a name of scandal, but of inspiration, because he proved that even those who fail can be raised for the greater good. At his tomb, women left braids of linen as a sign of respect. Children placed stones and pieces of rope, symbols of strength, imprisonment, and liberation. But it wasn't the strength that moved. It was the assumed weakness. It was regret. It was the return. Because the true climax of Samson's life was not the destruction of the temple, but the moment when he, alone, blind and humiliated, prayed for the last time with a surrendered heart. "Lord, just one more time, so that your name may be glorified." And God answered, not with an army, but with presence, not with fame, but with redemption. Samson was the man who fell 1,000 times, who lost himself in passions, who forgot who he was, who exchanged his calling for vanity. But he was also the man who, in the end, gave everything. And that surrender was worth more than all the victories of his youth, because the final victory was spiritual. In later generations, Samson was remembered with reverence and awe. His mistakes, yes, were recounted to warn, but his redemption was celebrated to inspire. And in the book of Judges, his name was recorded as an eternal reminder that God does not seek the strong, but the willing. The true strength does not come from arms, but from faith, and that even in the deepest darkness, there is light for those who cry out. The people of Israel would continue to face challenges, wars, and temptations, but they would never forget the one who, even though blind, saw further than anyone else. Samson died, but what he did lives on to this day. And whenever a broken heart cries out to God saying, "Lord, just one more time," the heavens will remember Samson's prayer, and the God who answers in the end also answers in the now. Samson's story is not just that of a man with superhuman strength. It is the story of a human heart, flawed, impetuous, but deeply marked by a divine calling. A man who lived intensely and made intense mistakes, but who, in the end, was remembered not for the size of his falls, but for the strength of his surrender. He was born to be a liberator, but for a long time, he fought without understanding what he really needed to free. Not only the people, but himself. While crushing lions and armies, Samson was dominated by passions. His eyes saw the enemies, but they were blind to the purpose, until the day he became truly blind. And there in the dark, he finally saw it. When he lost everything, his vision, his freedom, his reputation, he discovered that what really mattered could not be stolen: God's presence. The calling still pulsated, and even in chains, God had not abandoned him. Samson's end was not tragic, it was glorious, because he died a different man than the one he lived. He died with faith, he died with purpose. He died with a peaceful soul, and that is what touches us so deeply. There is no one so lost that they cannot be restored. There is no history so stained that God cannot rewrite it. Samson shows us that God does not look for perfection. He looks for surrender, that God is not limited by our past, but moved by our cry, and that sometimes the greatest miracle is not escaping prison, but finding redemption within it. So if you've already failed, know this: there is hope. If you feel distant, used, discarded, there is a God who still answers. Samson only needed one last prayer, and God not only listened, God acted. This story is for everyone who carries the weight of their own choices, who have strength but don't know how to use it, who have already tried and failed, who have already fallen and feel unworthy. Samson fell, but he fell into the arms of grace. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel right now. Turn on notifications to follow more stories like this of faith, pain, miracles, and redemption. Comment below, what touched you the most on this journey? Did you identify with Samson? Have you ever had a moment of failure and found strength in God? And if you haven't seen it yet, watch our next video now. David, the heart that defeated giants. A story that will move you and remind you that what God looks at is not the size of the warrior, but the size of the heart. Thanks for watching. This was the story of Samson, the warrior of superhuman strength. And remember, even heroes fall, but with God, they rise forever.